Lachlan Hurst drew a single line through his wife's name, handed the guest list back to his assistant without looking up, and said, "She'll be more comfortable at home." 14 years of marriage, dismissed in 9 words. He folded the paper in half, set it on the corner of his desk, and went back to his phone, like he hadn't just crossed out a person. His assistant, Neil Ferris, stood very still for 4 seconds. He would remember those 4 seconds for a long time. "Should I let her know, or—" "I'll handle it," Lachlan said, and then, as though the conversation had already ended, "Put Amber in her place. She knows the Rideau Coalition's lead partners personally. She's exactly who I need beside me tonight." Niall wrote the name down. He told himself it wasn't his business. He'd been telling himself things like that for 2 years. And Lachlan Hurst had absolutely no idea who he had just erased from that room. Before this story goes any further, drop your city in the comments right now. Let us see who's watching from coast to coast tonight. And if you're new to Ivory Secrets, please subscribe and stay with us, because this one is going to stay with you long after it ends. Let's go back to the beginning. The event was the Canadian Health Innovation Gala, held every October at the Chateau Laurier in Ottawa. One of those evenings that looked like a fundraiser, but functioned as something closer to a negotiation, where the real decisions happened between courses and in the margins of conversations that nobody officially acknowledged having. Senators attended. Hospital networks sent their boards. The country's most influential names in pharmaceutical development, health technology, and biomedical research arrived not to be seen, but to do what Ottawa does best: make consequential choices with a glass of wine in hand and a smile that revealed nothing. Lachlan had been working toward this particular evening for 16 months. His firm, Hurst Biomedical, had developed a diagnostic tool he believed could transform early cancer detection across the country. The science was sound. The prototypes had performed. What Lachlan needed now was the Rideau Coalition, a consortium of institutional health investors who controlled more than $800 million in sector funding and who did not commit that money to companies they hadn't personally vetted. They had agreed to attend tonight. Lachlan had one evening. He stood in his Ottawa hotel suite at 6:15, adjusted his tie for the 4th time, and felt the particular electric focus of a man who was certain the night was going to go exactly as planned. He was wrong about almost everything. What Lachlan told people about his wife was always some version of the same fond dismissal, delivered with the kind of warmth that is really just condescension wearing a nicer coat. "Camille is extraordinary," he would say, swirling whatever was in his glass, "but she's a homebody at heart. She loves her routines, her garden, her research. These big industry evenings, they're not really her world." People nodded, because people nod when a man of Lachlan's reputation speaks. They accepted. They moved on. Nobody thought to ask Camille herself, because Camille Osei-Laurent had made herself invisible so thoroughly, so deliberately, that even the people who sat across from her at dinner parties didn't really see her. She wore it the way a seasoned chess player leaves their strongest piece off the board. Kept in reserve, protected, waiting for the move that changes everything. Camille had grown up in Winnipeg, the daughter of a Ghanaian Canadian physician and a Quebecois high school biology teacher. She had her father's patience and her mother's precision, and from both of them she had inherited something rarer than either: the ability to see systems. To look at a complex thing, a supply chain, an immune response, a funding gap, a negotiation, and understand immediately what it was doing versus what it was supposed to do. By 26, she had a master's degree in global health policy from McGill and a reputation among her professors for the kind of analysis that made experienced researchers sit back in their chairs and reconsider what they thought they knew. At 29, she had joined a major international health NGO as a program director. At 31, she had quietly left. Quietly is the operative word. She didn't announce her departure with a press release or a professional post. She simply resigned, incorporated a new entity through a series of carefully structured holding companies that kept her name entirely out of the public record, and began building something she intended to matter. She called it the Northlight Foundation. Northlight moved into the places where global health funding consistently missed its mark, the villages in northern Ghana, where vaccine cold chains broke down in the August heat, the remote districts in the Philippines, where maternal health clinics had staff but not supplies, the communities in northern Manitoba where chronic illness rates were rising while access to diagnostic care was not. Northlight entered those gaps with the patience of someone who had spent years studying exactly why well-funded efforts failed, and the precision of someone who would not make the same mistakes. Within 3 years, Northlight's active programs covered 11 countries. Within 719. By the time Camille was 44 years old, sitting at her standing desk in their Toronto home office, surrounded by research briefs and satellite mapping data, the Northlight Foundation managed $340 million in health program funding and had contributed directly to the immunization of more than 3 million children. Almost nobody outside a small, fiercely loyal team knew she was behind it. She liked it that way. Then she met Lachlan. It was at a gala, fittingly, a cardiovascular research fundraiser in Toronto, 6 years into Northlight's operation. He was there because the event had been written up in the Globe and Mail. She was there because Northlight had quietly co-funded the research being celebrated that evening. He was charming, genuinely so, which she later recognized as his most dangerous quality. He listened. He asked questions. He laughed easily and without performance. He looked at her across the dinner table and said, "You're different from most people in these rooms. You're actually thinking about what's being said." She had filed that away as a warning sign. A man who values you for your listening is a man who may not love you when you decide to speak. But she was 37 and tired of being careful about everything, and he was warm and funny and real in a way that very few people in those rooms ever managed to be. They married 14 months later. The early years were genuinely good. Camille stepped back from Northlight's day-to-day operations and handed the helm to Solange Tremblay, her director of operations, who had been with the foundation since year 2, and was one of the most capable people Camille had ever worked alongside. She supported Lachlan through the hard early seasons of Hearst Biomedical, sat through hundreds of hours of pitch preparation, gave him feedback that he consistently took and consistently attributed in boardrooms to his own instinct. She noticed every time. The first real crack appeared at a dinner party in their home 3 years into the marriage. A business associate of Lachlan's, a man named Barry, who had built modest past wealth in commercial real estate and held very strong opinions about his own intelligence, was holding court at the table about a development deal that had collapsed. "Walked away with a $2 million loss," Barry said, laughing the way men laugh about money when they've never been genuinely worried about it. "Still can't figure out where the whole thing fell apart." Camille, who had barely touched her wine and had been mostly quiet all evening, said, without thinking, "The environmental assessment came back 2 months before closing with contaminating sometimes that should have flagged the remediation cost as prohibitive. It's in the municipal filings if you know where to look." The table went quiet. Barry looked at her. He looked at Lachlan. He looked back at her. "Well," he said, with the smile of a man who has decided to be charming rather than honest, "aren't you full of surprises?" Later, after the guests had gone and Camille was rinsing glasses, Lachlan leaned against the kitchen counter and said, "Barry felt a little put on the spot tonight." Camille set down the glass. "Barry lost $2 million on a preventable oversight. He's sensitive about it. Then he should have done his homework." Lachlan was quiet for a moment. Then, with the smooth certainty of a man who believes he is being reasonable, "Maybe just let me steer the business conversations when it's my colleagues. It's easier." Camille looked at him. "For whom?" He didn't answer. He folded the dish towel and walked upstairs. Camille stood in the kitchen alone and thought about that word, easier. She turned it over the way you turn over a stone to see what lives beneath it. That night she made a decision. She would watch. She would wait. She would stay quiet. Not because Lachlan had asked her to, but because she wanted to understand whether his preference for her silence was a passing insecurity or something deeper. Something structural. Something about who he had decided she was supposed to be. What she observed over the years that followed did not reassure her. She watched Lachlan build a version of their marriage for public consumption that had less and less to do with the actual woman he had married. In interviews, she became my incredibly supportive wife. At industry events, she became the composed woman who smiled warmly and volunteered nothing that would require follow-up. At home, her observations became overthinking it. Her recommendations were absorbed into his thinking without attribution. The way river water shapes stone. Invisibly, completely, without acknowledging what did the shaping. And her actual work. Northlight, the $340 million, the 3 million immunized children, remained invisible to him entirely, not because she had hidden it, exactly, because he had never once wondered enough to look. That was the part that stung most, not the dismissals, the incuriosity. The notification came through on a Tuesday evening in early October. Camille was at her standing desk, reviewing a site assessment from Northlight's Northern Kenya team, when her phone buzzed. It was an automated alert from the event management platform Lachlan's assistant used. She'd been on its administrative list since she'd helped coordinate a fundraiser 2 years prior. The message was 3 words and a name. Access revoked, Osei-Laurent Camille. She read it twice. She set the phone down on her desk and sat very still. Through the window she could see the backyard garden, her garden, the one she had planted herself from bare earth when they bought the house, that Lachlan described to guests as maintained by a service. She had put in the serviceberry tree herself, in November, in ground that was almost frozen. She had known it would take 3 years to establish. She had been patient. She sat in the quiet for a long time. She thought about Barry and the $2 million, and Lachlan's hand on the conversation, rerouting it away from her, like traffic around an inconvenient obstacle. She thought about 14 years of redirected contributions and smoothed over insights, and being introduced at industry events as the background detail in someone else's narrative. She thought about her mother's voice, steady and dry, from a kitchen in Winnipeg when Camille was 11 years old and had come home furious about a teacher who dismissed her analysis in front of the class. "You know what you know," her mother had said, without looking up from the pot she was stirring. "You don't have to prove it to people who aren't ready to sit. Wait, the moment will come." Camille picked up her phone. She called Solange. "I need something," she said when the call connected. "Name it." An invitation to the Health Innovation Gala in Ottawa, not as a +1, not as a spouse, as the founder of Northlight. There was a brief pause on Solange's end. They had worked together for 11 years. Solange knew enough about the shape of Camille's marriage to understand the weight of what she wasn't saying. "I'll call Dr. Asante," Solange said. Dr. Kwame Asante was the Rideau Coalition's senior managing partner. He also sat on Northlight's advisory board. He had spent 4 years trying to get Camille to accept a keynote invitation from the Coalition's annual symposium. He would make one phone call and consider it a privilege. "Done before morning," Solange said, then softer, "Are you all right?" Camille looked at the serviceberry tree through the window. It had finally taken this year. The branches were full. "I think I'm finally about to be," she said. Lachlan arrived at the Chateau Laurier at 7:15, feeling like a man who had rehearsed this exact performance his entire career. He knew how to work a room like this. He knew which conversations to open and which to let breathe. He knew how to make a powerful person feel individually chosen, specifically seen, even when the attention behind it was entirely strategic. Amber Kessler moved beside him with polished ease. She was 39, well-connected across the health sector, genuinely competent. Lachlan had chosen her for real professional reasons, and by his own logic, he had chosen well. What he had not accounted for was the difference between knowing the right names and being the right person. He located Dr. Kwame Asante across the room at 8 o'clock. Silver-haired, unhurried, the kind of man who had stopped needing to prove things so long ago he could barely remember what proving felt like. Lachlan crossed the room with careful confidence. "Quam, glad you made it." Asante shook his hand. His grip was firm. His smile was genuine. And his eyes, Lachlan didn't notice this, because he was too focused on managing his own approach, were scanning the room, looking for someone. "Good event," Asante said. "Your industry always puts on a strong showing here." A pause. "Is your wife here this evening?" Lachlan's smile did not waver. He had practiced not wavering. "Camille prefers quieter evenings," he said smoothly. "These large industry gatherings aren't really her scene." Asante looked at him for one beat, longer than was comfortable. "I see," he said. He excused himself with the quiet efficiency of a man who had just made a small but significant note in a file. He kept on people he was deciding whether or not to trust. Lachlan didn't notice. He was already scanning the room for the next conversation. Niall was near the chateau's main entrance at 8:40 when his phone buzzed. A courtesy notification from the Gala's organizing committee, routine, the kind of administrative message event coordinators sent to ensure smooth reception. He read it. He read it again. "Please note, Dr. Camille Osei-Laurent, founder and executive director of the Northlight Foundation, will be in attendance this evening as a distinguished guest of the Rideau Coalition. Please ensure appropriate reception protocol." Niall stood very still. Northlight Foundation. He knew that name. Everyone in health sector investment knew that name. He had read a profile of Northlight in the Walrus 2 years prior. The piece had described the organization as brilliant, reclusive, staggeringly effective. Its leadership deliberately unknown, the kind of foundation that moved through the world as though it had no ego attached because it genuinely didn't. 3 million children, 19 countries, $340 million under management. The author had called it the most consequential health organization most Canadians have never heard of. He thought about the guest list that morning. Lachlan's pen. The 4 seconds of silence he had filled with compliance instead of the truth, which was, "Sir, I'm not certain. This is a decision you'll be glad you made." He put his phone in his jacket pocket. He stood for another moment, watching the gala continue inside. The glittering performance of people who believed themselves to be very important, and he thought about what was about to come through the front doors. Some corrections, he decided, needed to arrive on their own. He went back to his post. He waited. The main doors opened at 9 o'clock. Later, the people who were there would try to explain what happened when Dr. Camille Osei-Laurent walked into the Chateau Laurier ballroom, and they would find that the available words were either too dramatic or not nearly enough. Some would say the room quieted. Some would say conversation simply paused, the way music pauses when the needle lifts. Everything's suspended, mid-gesture, mid-sentence. Some would say they looked up because something in the quality of the room shifted. Some essential thing in the air rearranged itself. What is certain is this. Dr. Kwame Asante turned first. He had been mid-sentence with a colleague when something in his peripheral vision resolved into a shape he recognized, and he stopped talking. He straightened. His face, the face of a man who had spent 40 years in rooms full of impressive people, did something those closest to him had rarely seen it do. It opened. "My God," he said quietly, and then louder with warmth that was entirely without performance, "Camille." The gala's MC stepped to the microphone and said, with the precise carrying diction of someone who understood the weight of the moment, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the founder and executive director of the Northlight Foundation, Dr. Camille Osei-Laurent." The applause began at Asante's table, then it moved. By the time Camille had taken 5 steps into the room, the sound had become something full and genuine. Not the polite, obligatory response of a captive audience, but the real kind. The sound people make when someone arrives who they have been hoping to see. Camille moved through it with a composure that was almost unbearable to witness. Not cold, not performance, simply settled. The deep, earned stillness of a woman who had decided, finally and completely, who she was, and had simply arrived to be that person. No apology. No announcement. Nothing left to prove. She was 44 years old, in a gown the color of deep water. And she was the most arresting presence in a room full of people who commanded rooms for a living. Across that ballroom, Lachlan Hurst heard the announcement. His champagne glass stopped halfway to his mouth. He heard Northlight Foundation. He heard the applause. He turned. And he saw his wife. What happened to his face in that moment was not something he could manage or contain. It moved through shock, disbelief, and confusion. And then, underneath all of those, in a place he would not have chosen to have visible, something slower and more terrible than shock. The recognition of a man who is beginning, for the first time, to understand the actual dimensions of life he has been living. Amber touched his arm. Lachlan, do you know her? He didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on Camille, who was now being embraced by Asante with the warmth of a man greeting someone whose work he genuinely reveres. On Camille, who had moved into conversation with two other coalition partners, both of them leaning toward her, with the ease of people who have been waiting for exactly this conversation. On Camille, who looked up from that exchange, found Lachlan's eyes across the length of the room, and held them. No anger, no triumph, no performance of any kind. Just clear the way still water is clear. And Lachlan, for the first time in 14 years, was looking directly into it. The next 20 minutes were the longest of his professional life. He watched his wife move through the room he had spent 16 months fighting to enter, and he watched that room respond to her in a way it had never responded to him. Not with politeness. Not with the managed warmth of people fulfilling a social obligation. With genuine relief. The relief of people who have been hoping to speak with someone and are finally being given the chance. Asante kept her beside him for 11 straight minutes. Lachlan could see, from across the room, the quality of that conversation, the back and forth, the specificity, the way Asante kept nodding. Not socially. The way people nod when they are receiving information they actually needed. Amber leaned close to him and said, very quietly, I think you may have made a significant mistake tonight. He didn't respond. She was right, he knew it, and knowing it felt like standing on a floor that had just revealed itself to be glass. He found Camille at 9:50, standing near the east windows with a glass of water, and the particular stillness of someone who has no need to fill silence with movement. Hello, Lachlan, she said. Her voice was quiet, completely even, and it carried in those two syllables the full weight of everything she had chosen not to say for 14 years. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Northlight, he said. His voice came out lower than he intended. How long? It wasn't quite a question. Since before we met, she said. The words arrived on him like cold water. Before they met. Before the fundraiser, where he'd been so charmed by the quiet, thoughtful woman who wasn't performing for anyone. Before 14 years of her sharpening his thinking, absorbing his dismissals, being introduced at every event he cared about as his supportive backdrop. Before all of it, she had already been this. Why didn't you tell me? He said, and the question, for all its simplicity, carried something genuine underneath it. Not the indignation of a deceived man. The anguish of someone beginning to understand what he has wasted. Because I wanted to know something first, Camille said. Whether you loved me, or whether you loved the usefulness of having me quietly in your corner. He stared at her. And now you know, he said. And now I know, she said. The gala continued around them. The orchestra played. Waiters moved between tables. 800 people performed the careful rituals of influence and ambition they had come here to perform. But in the 2 feet of space between Lachlan and Camille, everything was completely still. And in that stillness, Lachlan heard something he had never let himself hear. The sound of his own silence. Not the comfortable silence of a man who believes he has everything accounted for. The other kind, the sound of every question he had never asked. Every morning he had walked past the most extraordinary person in his life and chosen, without realizing it was a choice, not to stop. He found Asante at 10:15. The conversation that followed was not the one he had spent 16 months preparing for. Your wife outlined a phased pilot structure for the diagnostic rollout this evening, Asante said, in the measured tone of a man who delivers important things quietly. It addresses our primary concern about scaling too quickly into underserved northern communities before the supply chain infrastructure is ready. She suggested a co-implementation model that brings Northlight's existing community health networks into the first 3 sites. A pause. It's a stronger proposal than what your team brought us, Lachlan. Lachlan sat with that for a moment. She didn't come here to save my deal, he said. No, Asante said. She came here to be herself. The fact that being herself happened to solve your problem, that's its own kind of answer, isn't it? Lachlan had no response to that. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, she's the best strategic mind I've ever known. Asante looked at him steadily. We've known that for years, he said. He found her again at 11, in a side corridor off the main ballroom, carpeted in deep burgundy, lit soft enough for privacy. She was waiting for Solange to bring the car. The framework you gave Kwame, Lachlan said. You didn't have to do that. After this morning, It was the right structure for the project, she said simply. Not for you. For the project, those are communities in northern Ontario and northern Quebec. I know those supply chains. I've worked in them for years. She held his gaze. Don't thank me for my work. I removed you from the list without a word, he said. I know. Without a conversation, without it even, he pressed his fingers against his mouth briefly. Without it even occurring to me that the room might need you more than it needed me. The corridor was quiet. It never occurred to you to wonder, Camille said, softly, without cruelty, just with the plain, unadorned weight of something that had been true for a very long time. No, he said, that's the thing I keep coming back to, not what I didn't know, that I never wondered. A long silence settled between them. We need to talk, he said, not tonight, but we need to. Camille considered him the way she had been considering things her entire life. Carefully, without rushing, without the need to arrive at comfort before she had arrived at truth. Yes, she said, we do. She pulled on her coat. She looked at him once more, clear, direct, without apology, and she walked back through the gala and out through the front doors of the Chateau Laurier. Lachlan stood in the corridor for a long time. He thought about the guest list, the pen, the 9 words delivered with such certainty. She'll be more comfortable at home. He had been wrong about everything, but wrong in the specific way that is hardest to carry. Not wrong because he lacked information, but wrong because he had never once been curious enough to reach for it. 3 weeks after the gala, the Northlight Foundation issued its first public statement in 11 years of operation. Solange had drafted it. Camille had written it twice more. The final version was 43 words, deliberately brief, entirely without apology. It confirmed that Dr. Camille Osei-Laurent, founder and executive director, was stepping into a public leadership role. It announced Northlight's formal partnership with the Rideau Coalition's Health Infrastructure Fund. It named the co-implementation pilot for the Hearst Biomedical Diagnostic Program across 6 northern communities. It did not mention Lachlan. It was entirely, completely about Camille. By the following morning, the Globe and Mail, the Walrus and Maclean's had all made contact. A professor at UBC School of Public Health posted a note on Northlight's site. We have been trying to understand who built this organization for 6 years. Finding out it was you explains absolutely everything. Camille read that message twice. Then she set her phone on her desk and looked out the window at the backyard. The serviceberry tree. The garden she had planted from nothing, season, soil by soil, in ground that had resisted her in the beginning and rewarded her patience in the end. The garden that Lachlan had described to a dinner guest just last spring as something a service takes care of. She thought about her mother's kitchen in Winnipeg, the wooden spoon, the steady voice that never overstated what it knew. You know what you know. Wait, the moment will come. The moment had come. And what she had done with it was not revenge. It was never revenge, and anyone who mistook it for that was watching the wrong thing. What she had done was simpler than revenge and far more durable. She had stopped editing herself for the comfort of people who had never deserved the performance. She picked up her phone and called her sister Madeline, who had known about Northlight for years and kept that knowledge with the absolute fidelity that only family can hold. "I read it," Madeline said before Camille could speak. Her voice was bright and slightly unsteady. "I read the whole thing, Camille. Mom would have cried. She absolutely would have." "I know," Camille said quietly. Outside, the serviceberry tree held its branches against the October sky, full, established, entirely itself. The way things are when you have given them enough time, enough patience, and enough faith that the right season will eventually arrive. It always does. For the woman who is willing to wait for it.